our new significant interest group with GLEPHA, which aims to counter the criminalisation of neurodiversity and neurodisability. And my contact details are there, so if at any point you've got any questions we don't manage to get to at the end, or you want to get in touch about joining the group or finding out a bit more information about the group, please do feel free to email. You can also contact any of the speakers directly as well. Our three wonderful speakers today are the co-conveners of the significant interest group. So we'll get started right away, and I'll introduce our first speaker, Professor Hugh Williams.
Well, thank you very much. Hi. So I'll just share my screen, and there we are. Oh, and everything's hidden by something else now. So yeah, you can all see that, right? Is that okay?
I can't see anything, Hugh.
Can't see anything? Okay, in that case, press that button. And am I now sharing?
Yeah, you are, yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, so if there's significant interest, this will become a special interest group in neurodiversity. So we're hoping that that will happen. The key thing being that there's a huge amount of issues related to neurodiversity, neurodisability in populations who get criminalized worldwide. And I'm Hugh Williams at Exeter University. So this is people who offend tend to be described as having all kinds of problems in terms of thinking, decision making, thinking ahead about issues, impulse control, maybe lacking empathy, maybe lacking an ability to recognize what's the right action and if it would have a negative effect on one's future and all the rest of it. This is interesting because, of course, many people who end up offending are relatively young, and there's this generally found spike in crime between the ages of 13 and 23. So a huge amount of crime is age-related and, of course, sex-related, because 80 to 90% of people who are in the criminal justice system would be boys or men. So decision-making might be an issue, it's a huge issue in terms of reoffending and the being of young age, because if somebody who's relatively young is incarcerated and then is discharged from custody, within a year, half of them are in prison again, and within 2 years, 75%. So there's something about the systems that we put in place to maybe contain rather than rehabilitate young people who offend maybe isn't working. One of the big issues in the whole area is the realization a few years ago that the brain systems of people who are young are evolving, and they're still evolving in their teenage years. The brains of 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 14 and 16 and 18 and 19-year-olds are still evolving. One of the key changes that's happening is around 13 and 14. There's the building up of adult levels of urges and feelings and needs and so on and so forth. Towards drive towards procreation, one might say the recreation or procreation, really kicks in around 14, 15, to be able to be with people, and the sense of adolescent risk-taking is particularly increased in company of other adolescents, and increased times 4. So you've got a perfect storm of wants and needs and urges kind of developing in a social context. But there's a lack of control. The frontal brain systems of your typical 15, 16, and even 17-year-old isn't keeping pace with that. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the sides of the brain forward in brain systems that manages planning, impulse control, and decision making, is not adult yet. It's not adult yet until 19, 20, 21. So there's a huge issue around neuromaturity in young people who come into contact with the law. One of the biggest causes of neurodiverse conditions in criminal justice systems and the biggest cause of death and disability worldwide, is traumatic brain injury. Brain injury is occasioned when someone has a fall, has a car crash, is assaulted, or is in a fight where the brain is moved around inside the skull. Imagine a baseball bat across the head, brain moves around inside the skull. And so the area where the bat hit the head, there's an area of injury likely there. There's lesions and contra effects. There's also the brain is moving around, and all those connections in the brain with the long pathways may be pulled apart, like the kind of electrical wiring, for example, is pulled and may be pulled apart. Importantly, the brain sits inside the skull. Skull offers protection. The upper side of the skull is nice and smooth. The underside, where the brain sits inside the skull, isn't smooth. It's got jaggedy edges, the sphenoid wings, and other bony protrusions. So the brain is basically a bit like Jello on a cheese grater. So when it moves around, when it gets hit, it then wobbles about like Jello on a cheese grater, leading to, as you can see over here, injuries to the frontal lobes, temporal lobes, and mesolimbic systems, which are the feeling states. Typically, then, the kind of problems that kind of come along from brain trauma are to do with impulse control, planning ahead, thinking things through. I'm not going to talk about the severities of brain injury, but we can tell you more about that as we go along, maybe. One of the biggest risk factors for having a brain injury is age, so being male, risk-taking behavior, and so on and so forth. Another one is socioeconomics. The poorest 5% in society are 5 times more likely at under 5 years of age to have a brain injury. So that's the 555 issue. And these injuries would be relatively forgotten about as the child grows up, becomes adolescent, and struggles in school and all the rest of it. In general society, we find that 12% of general society have brain injuries. 2 in 100 have moderate severe brain injury, and 10 in 100 have mild brain injuries. So give you some scale and scope of the problem. The kind of issues after brain trauma are in about 60% plus of people with moderate severe brain injury, problems with inhibitory control, so impulse is poor, problems in temper management, maybe getting withdrawn, maybe getting suicidal, but often having explosive kind of feelings that you can't control very easily. Even happens after mild brain injury in kids, especially in adolescents. So you get attention deficit disorder due to brain injury, you get oppositional defiant disorder, you get conduct disorder. So these are common. 3 or 4 in 10 kids after brain injury of any kind have these kind of problems longer term, sometimes subtle, sometimes significant. So how it's related to crime is that it used to be thought that brain injury was just something that happened to people who offend because it happens at the same time as taking risks. Not the case. The case is that a brain injury increases the chances of crime. My colleague Stina Fussell did a study in Sweden showing that about 2% of Swedes at some point become violent offenders. But if there's a head injury in their health records, then 9% of them become violent offenders at some point. Sina looked at 35 years worth of data on the registers of health and crime in Sweden for that data. If the siblings of the violent brain injured population, about 4.5% of them became offenders. So basically, brain injury triples your risk of violent crime in general, and doubles your risk if you already have some criminogenic tendencies because of family background and role models and so on and so forth. Importantly, when it comes to kids as well, is to think about the trajectory over time, just to give you an idea. So the kids in New Zealand have been followed up in Christchurch when they've got brain injuries at the age of around 5, and these are relatively mild brain injuries, but kept in for observation. Within 2 years, compared to orthopedic controls, they are much more likely to have problems in school, attention, concentration problems. Within 4 or 5 years, they're more likely to be excluded from school for disruptive behavior. And by the time they're 14 and 15, in trouble with the law. So there's clear evidence of causal effects of brain trauma on crime. When we've looked at head injury and brain injury rates in our prison population in the UK, this is in Exeter prison, we find 60%, so 6 times as many as you'd expect people in prison to have brain injury. The proportions of moderate to severe are very high, 16% with moderate to severe, so therefore their brains are changed for their lifetime, and about 40-50% with mild brain injuries but significant mild brain injuries. And they were young at the age of coming into prison if there was a brain injury history. We've done, this is Gire, one of my wonderful doctorate students, and we showed the same pattern in young people in prison in the UK, with more brain injuries being associated with more violence, 45% knockout histories. And in data I'm not going to share with you today, but we'll mention more likely after brain injury that you get into, you get utilized by organized crime groups and gangs, and you lack other social groups, and you get more depressed and anxious and utilized because you're vulnerable to being used. When we look at population of women who end up in prison, what we find is that there's a huge rate of brain injury, 60% plus. One of the biggest forms one of the biggest causes of brain injury in women in prison is domestic violence. And of course, that speaks to the whole issue of linking trauma to traumatic brain injury, very specifically in kids and young people, but also in women in prison. The kinds of issues that women in prison may have after brain injury include problems in socialization, problems in not being able to engage well in treatment, and poor communication, and so on, and massively increased risk of suicide. There's data is emerging in various ways in different populations around the world showing that this is an issue. In Germany, for example, data showing that violent offenders are much more likely to have lesions in the frontal lobes of the brain compared to non-violent, and definitely compared to people in general community. So, so brain injury is associated with poor engagement in treatment, greater levels of infractions in prisons, and recurrence of crime, with a recent study in Canada showing an increased risk of reoccurrence of crime of 39% when the brain injury is there. So if you're working in this area in any way whatsoever, you want to know whether somebody that you're working with has a brain injury, because there's an increased likelihood that their needs, but the things that they need to be able to help change behavior are to do with memory, planning, regulation of control, and changing coping habits, and so on. So we've been in the UK, we've been putting into place screening for brain trauma in our young people in justice. And what we've been finding as part of doing that is we find that there's a very high level, and when you got more dosage of brain injury, you're more likely to be self-harming and suicidal, more than 50%, but also typically you've been in care, in social care. So therefore there's opportunities missed in societies to look after these kids better, to reduce the chances of them ending up in the criminal justice system. Hope, you've heard about from the start, has recently published a lovely paper showing how parenting techniques associated with being more neglectful are associated with more likely brain injuries and reactive aggression. So kids who grow up were not being able to really hold themselves back because of head injuries. We also had other work linking to traumatic kind of lives. And another colleague of mine, Bethany Clasby, currently in New Zealand, has done some really nice work showing how in kids in prison, you can track back and find the head injuries were associated with being excluded from school. So it backs up the earlier work in New Zealand about school exclusion being a trigger for actually putting them some support. In terms of neurodiversity and issues, Nathan will pick this up a bit later, just to mention that it's often comorbid, so brain injury with and or without attention deficit disorder, autism spectrum disorder, possibly likely as well, communication disorders being, absolutely more likely than not in a population, and fetal alcohol syndrome also in the mix. So if you want to know more about some of that work, we can tell you more, but in adults in prison, the rate of ADHD and autism is also relatively high compared to general population. So children most at risk of having brain injuries are least likely to get support and help to help them change behavior. School inclusion systems are really important, and as well as parent and caregiver support and support around deflection, diversion, and maintaining people in community as much as possible through multi-agency working, which you'll hear about more through Stan in a moment. Just to thank many of my wonderful colleagues that have helped with this area over the years kind of here, and I'll just end it there. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you so much, Hugh, for that introduction. And we'll hand over now to Professor Nathan Hughes from the University of Sheffield.
My turn to struggle with pressing buttons while I try and talk. Thank you, Hugh. So my name's Nathan Hughes. I'm kind of the social scientist to complement Hugh's neuroscience, I guess, in the crew. So I'm Professor of Adolescent Health and Justice at the University of Sheffield, which essentially means I'm interested in how kind of experiences of health and development might lead to engagement in the criminal justice system, and then similarly what engagement in the criminal justice system means for your subsequent kind of health trajectories. And I guess our SIG isn't primarily focused on young people, but I apologise in advance that most of my work is, so I'll inevitably keep coming back to young people. I guess my role is to kind of be squeezed in the middle between Hugh and Stan, in that I'm going to try and build on what Hugh said about the role of neurodisability in increasing people's kind of propensity for behaviour that might be labelled as criminal, and set Stan up to talk about what we might do about that. But I wanted to really take a bit of time to frame this as a public health issue, as something which folk who are engaged in GLEPHA should be interested in. So I want to do that by just talking through kind of 3 propositions that are at the kind of centre of how I think about this. And so framing this as more of a social issue perhaps than Hugh's initial discussion around impairment has done. So the first of those propositions kind of mirrors what Hugh has sort of touched on already, which is this notion that neurodevelopmental disabilities serve as really important determinants of criminal justice system involvement. So you saw, Hugh flashed up the stats, and I'll come to some of those in a moment. But I wanted to frame it around the work that we've been doing recently through the Lancet, which shamelessly publicised the article, which you can download for free if you register on the website, but that tries to frame these issues as determinants of criminalisation. So clearly building on the kind of well-established ideas of social determinants of health, where actually people's health outcomes can be seen to be heavily dependent on social and environmental factors. Here we can sort of reframe that a little to think about how sort of difficulties and experiences that might affect health and development in adolescence really impact upon then journeys into our criminal justice systems. So this particular article is quite wide-ranging. It covers psychiatric disorders and mental health and adverse childhood experiences and trauma and so on, but clearly today focusing in on some of the issues of sort of neurodevelopmental impairment. And the infographic is there, but the key table for today, I guess, is this one, and I won't go through the details of it. I mean, Hugh's obviously picked up a lot on the traumatic brain injury example, but across the piece, any kind of defined neurodevelopmental disorder or any way of measuring aspects of neurodevelopment inherently will always show a massive disproportionality among youth justice populations, but particularly youth populations in our prisons. I guess there's a couple of things I just want to highlight on the slide. The first is that despite drawing in sort of co-authors from almost every continent, we found no kind of good evidence of studies in low and middle income countries, which is perhaps unsurprising given the nature of some of this work. But again, in terms of this special interest group and some of the things that we're interested in developing, there's a real kind of call to arms, I think, around trying to develop an evidence base beyond the kind of usual suspect countries where we're collecting this data. And then secondly, just to highlight, I guess, that buried in that box around fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, the very different rates that we find in our studies in Canada and Australia of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder among Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal populations, which links in, I guess, to some of the things I want to unpack today. That it's not sort of simply the impairment itself or the experience of disability itself, which is going to determine someone's journey into the criminal justice system, but thinking about how some of the kind of social factors, some of the environmental factors might be put to play here as well. So it's not about a condition or impairment that we might be interested in as necessarily alone causing that journey into criminal justice, but instead we might adopt a kind of social model of disability, I guess, that many of you will be familiar with, where we think about those social factors, the environmental factors, how we respond to someone's difficulties and their impairment, and how that then influences that risk that we might, that they might find themselves in our criminal justice systems. So clearly, as I say here, there are a myriad of different ways in which we might address this criminalisation if we think about it through that kind of social model and think about social health, education and community interventions. So it's some examples here of how neurodisability can both increase kind of exposure to, but also increase the impact of these kind of social environmental risk factors. So what we as criminologists might frame as the sort of factors that increase kind of propensity towards criminal justice. And as Hugh said, social inequality has a big role to play here. And Hugh drew your attention to that stat around TBI being far more prevalent among deprived communities. I would also highlight that actually those forms of social inequality also mean that people may experience their impairment and their difficulty differently. So if you're living in the context of poverty, if you're living in the context of a lack of access to specialist support, if you're living in a context where certain lenses are used to define and make sense of you and your life, you might find yourself at greater risk of significant impact from that impairment in terms of your journey through services. And one of our studies around sort of children in care is a good example of that, I think. So it uses the same chat assessments that Hugh mentioned, but looked at levels of significant language impairment among a custodial population. And in short, found that sort of 26 out of 95 in the custodial institution had a kind of diagnosable significant language impairment, but worryingly, only 7 had received any support previously in recognition of that impairment. And of 11 out of those 26 that were living in care, none of them had received any kind of meaningful support to address their language needs. So there's that sense of having an impairment in a particular setting, despite it being a setting where you would imagine, where you might imagine wrapped around care, actually, a real lack of the necessary support to deal with those difficulties. The other examples, again, reflect things Hugh's talked about, but show how some of the kind of key factors that we think about as key drivers towards criminality actually play out very problematically for these populations. And I'm going to just pick up, just to follow through on what Hugh spoke about, just try and follow through on an example of where we might sort of see some of this. So, following on the TBI example, we can see there are various points at which experience of services and systems after traumatic brain injury have the potential to intervene to improve outcomes, but actually often serve to do the opposite. So we know, and again, this is very generalized and probably very UK focused, and I'm sure in other parts of the world all of this is smooth and solved, but we know there are real disjoints between our health services and our education services, and so the transition after brain injury back into school is very poorly managed, and there might be a lack of information flowing with that young person to an education service about how to understand that brain injury and respond. We know that TBIs, as you described, can result in some very kind of complex and actually very heterogeneous sort of presentations of difficulties that require very bespoke support, and therefore, at least in the UK, don't fit very neatly into the sort of criteria we use for special educational needs, the sort of interventions that we might use. And of course, if those needs aren't met, then they will continue, they will grow, and they will be cumulative. There's a particular issue here around early childhood injuries, again, as she describes, and what that might mean for development later in life. And if you damage a part of the brain that you're not using in childhood, but when you get to adolescence, should be developed, should come on track, and should allow you to do some of those higher order things. If that part of the brain is damaged, then you may not develop in the appropriate ways at that point. But yet we know, information sharing between schools is not particularly good either. And so if that happened in primary school, the secondary school might not be aware, let alone attribute it to that TBI. So another kind of set of interventions there, the opportunities that are missed. And instead, what we see is young people with various forms of neurodisability, but TBI in particular, instead seeing the behaviour as the problem. So the impulsivity, the aggression, the low tolerance gets seen as the presenting problem rather than some of those kind of underlying learning difficulties that should be targeted. So again, a kind of set of sort of social factors, social experiences that we should be interested in framing this as a broader kind of public health issue where we're joining up our services and our responses here. But the final point that I wanted to focus on was then what happens in our criminal justice system. So if we know that young people are at greater risk of demonstrating criminality and being absorbed into our system, what do we then do with them? And of course, we can highlight a whole range of biases and problems in our practices that increase the risk of criminalisation and recidivism, therefore, among these young people. I won't go into too much detail around it, but a whole set of challenges in our systems, particularly rooted in a lack of professional training, a lack of understanding. Again, generalising, but certainly in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, where we've done our work, professionals not receiving, kind of routinely receiving training on neurodisability, despite the high prevalence in those populations, not understanding the impact on behaviour or on how someone might engage with the intervention. A lack of assessment tools, certainly at arrest, prior to court appearance. Hugh highlighted one in the UK that we might use in a youth prison, but often that's the first assessment for those young people in the criminal justice journey, and is clearly very late in that journey. Because of this kind of lack of understanding and lack of recognition, there are a whole range of processes that we use that are therefore not taking account of these difficulties, processes that really assume sort of typical developmental capacities and competences, even among young people, and clearly some real barriers to access to justice there. So, for example, forensic interviewing techniques that are used will assume someone is able to engage in that sort of conversation where you're able to sort of break up your story of events and flip back and forward between particular aspects of that story, and that can be very difficult for people with particular forms of impairment. And we also know that specialist support isn't there, that we're not able to refer people in criminal justice always to the sort of specialist interventions that might be needed, and therefore we continue to do the things that we would normally do with offenders, that don't then take account of the underlying causes of offending or of the barriers to engagement. And it's bad form to quote yourself, but I keep doing it. And the argument that me and Pratibha make in this paper is around this is what's kind of causing this kind of journey through the system. So it's inherently tautological. The failings of the system to effectively support those young people so as to prevent reoffending, reinforce their involvement with the system, its continued failure to do so. So you get this kind of churn of doing the same thing again, but probably doing more of it and more intense, even though it's the thing that's not working. And therefore, as you churn through the system, you end up in the only place that our systems have left for people, which is custody. So I just want to end with a call to arms, really, kind of recognition that the people are starting to get this, and there is a requirement for our systems to do something about it. So the Committee on the Rights of the Child, its most recent sort of general comment on child justice, really highlights this as an issue that we need to move on. It highlights the growing understanding of the issues as we're describing them, and the need, therefore, to divert children with neurodevelopmental disabilities out of the system, or in the very least to build in the adjustments that we require in order to ensure access to justice and address this discrimination. So again, really just a call to arms for those of you who are interested in these issues and grappling with how we might approach them in your kind of country context, to get in touch and sort of build some of this momentum around how we address these issues. I think I'll end there.
Wonderful, thank you, Nathan. That was fantastic, and I will just share my screen now. Lovely, and we'll hand over to Superintendent Stan Gilmore from Thames Valley Police to tell us a bit more about what we can do about this problem.
Thanks, Hope. So just moving on from what you and Nathan have clearly articulated into, so what do we do in a public health approach to that across all of our systems, laid over criminal justice, and we've built this model taken from the sequential intercept model to start to examine those opportunities that we have to make sure that children, young people, those with neurodevelopmental disorders and disabilities are identified early. There is service to meet their need, and there is recognition across the whole systems of the added vulnerabilities that pile on top in the way that kind of Hugh's described. So this model really looks across the life course, from the younger children on the left through to older adults on the right, as those risks increase and begin to cluster, and the dosage and that kind of tautology that Nathan explained begins to create multiple morbidities within this population, and we can see that mapped across a criminal justice picture, where at its earliest point, first contact with criminal justice, all the way through to the kind of really late interventions that happen through rehabilitation and probation, etc. So the model splits up opportunities at different intercept points to be able to put your foot on the ball really, and slow things down and ask yourself some questions of the system to say, does the system have capacity and capability to be able to clearly identify and articulate the problems and the needs, and then make sure that things are joined up at a community level in order to do something about those needs? Or do we not have the right levels of service to meet those needs, and do people then come into contact with criminal justice and end up within policing and criminal justice system and not receiving the kind of treatment necessarily that they need to deal with the issues they have? So on the left of this, a whole systems approach, so one that looks at health, at education, at social care, at criminal justice, at voluntary community, faith, social enterprise groups, to say, actually, are we all joined up in this? Do we all recognize and work together to do something about these issues as they present to us, or are we working in our silos, often against each other, often doing as much harm as is good is done in other areas, or or do we just not serve our populations properly at that intercept zero, at that community services end? And do we have, on top of all of that, do we have the right kind of crisis support for when people end up in crisis and perhaps are approaching contact with criminal justice, or have made early contact with criminal justice? Do we have the right kind of knowledge and support to de-escalate the issues that we see? So in that sense, in the kind of early intervention sense, perhaps, what is the universal provision that's there and accessible to all, which may be about education, it may be about peer support, it may be about access to services, but what type of universal provision do we have? Often focused on children, on parents, on those kind of early years settings. And is it sufficient to join services up to be able to provide the kind of preemptive, perhaps even primordial intercept activity that's required so that issues don't escalate into contact with criminal justice? Then at intercept one, where the police have come into contact, and this may be through a crisis, an emergency call for service to an emergency service, in this case the police, and a police immediate response to deal with that crisis. Is there enough knowledge? Is there enough capacity in the system for that incident to be de-escalated back into community services where the appropriate needs can be met? Or is that shortcut to take people straight into custody, and where, as Nathan said, they may not see anyone to be able to address their needs, identify their vulnerabilities, until they actually get to intercept 3 and they end up in custody in prison. But at intercept 1, we're looking for opportunities to deflect people away from criminal justice, so not to make an arrest, to identify and then join people up with education or social care or welfare needs. Where there is an arrest made, can we then immediately divert into something that is not kind of police custody setting, a place of safety? Do place of safety exist for people who are maybe in crisis, but maybe also need better support? And do we understand the context within which people are operating in. Hugh clearly expressed what the context looks like for many people that pick up brain injuries, etc. They're living within a context that is higher risk anyway. And do we identify those, and is there something that we can do about them? And can we focus on those locations, because we know that, and it's been said as well, that these issues cluster in the areas of higher poverty, higher multiple deprivation within the environment, within the individual, within the family, within the community, the neighbourhood, etc. But the cluster. So can we focus our activity on making sure that these inequalities are addressed through adequate problem solving that includes all parties, but significantly includes the police, so that we're not criminalising neurodevelopmental disabilities. And in this sense, we're looking at targeted support in the case of secondary levels of kind of public health prevention. We're looking at older children perhaps, and maybe young adolescents in this space who are coming into first contact with justice services, primarily as a way to identify their needs and then divert from criminal justice. At Intercept 2, we've at this point we've made an arrest. Bringing people into police custody. Do we have an opportunity here to identify and address the vulnerabilities that we identify? Have we got the right skills, the right screening tools in place, the appropriate capacity and capability inside and outside of police custody to be able to deal with those issues and navigate people away from criminal justice services, to look at out-of-court disposals for people, so a way of satisfying the criminal justice requirements, but in an out-of-court, in a community or a kind of third sector provision, so that we can divert people away from being dragged into criminal justice and into custodial services, which is where we end up at Intercept 3. And again, we're still looking at ways to divert when people go into senior courts perhaps, or magistrate courts, looking at opportunities to take the information that we've perhaps gathered in earlier intercepts by having better provision around screening and around collation of information around individuals and their social context and their family context, so that we have an appropriate briefing to go into court, so that a diversion can still be considered. But where there is a need for a remand or a period of incarceration, it's done on the basis of good information and good knowledge. And where that happens, that information follows people into court, into custody, rather than, as Nathan said, for that to be the first point where these vulnerabilities are identified. This is actually part of a kind of thought through procedure, and on arrival, the individuals are met with people who are knowledgeable of their circumstances, and the treatment is then available as required. And then we get further into kind of, these are older people potentially, going into prison. Not necessarily, there are secure settings as well, but in general terms, we're looking across the life course a bit further down the road here, where we're looking at kind of specialist interventions, maybe in tertiary prevention space, young adults and adults, who have possibly, as Nathan said, circulated through criminal justice system a number of times, perhaps not having received the kind of right level of identification of their issues, or the right level of treatment required to them, or the right level of joined up support inside and outside of prison that's needed to prevent them from being drawn back into criminal behavior. So at the point where they're leaving secure estate or prison, how are we reconnecting these people back with their communities, with health services, with employment, with housing, with family support, with education, that's in a way that's needed to prevent them from re-entering that cycle again. And what is in place to enable that to happen at a local level. And then for those who are at the kind of tertiary end of prevention, who have long-standing issues, TBI, neurodevelopmental disabilities, with the the comorbidities that by this point will undoubtedly exist in terms of health, substance use disorders, mental ill health issues, homelessness, etc. How do we then at Intercept 5 make sure that we have a proper level of engagement and management and rehabilitation that is centered in community services to ensure that we are risk managing those people appropriately and preventing the kind of intergenerational transmission of these issues and avoiding a kind of criminalisation of later generations. So this is the model that we're working on. It's the way that we feel we can identify the joined up but different services that are required at each of those intercepts in a way that pulls the whole system together in a public health approach and is very centered on services with and for our communities. So I think we've got some time now. I think there's 10 minutes left. If there's any questions or any discussion that we want to have, I'll hand back to you, Hope.
Lovely, thank you so much, Stan, that was wonderful. And I will just again flash up this side with contact details on if anybody wants to get in touch about the group or ask about joining or anything like that, just before I stop sharing and we go into the discussion. I haven't seen any questions pop in so far, but I'm sure that you might have some ideas for discussion points around implementing the model and what the key barriers are and where we take the SIG going forwards. So we can open that up.
People are thinking and typing. I'll just say a little bit more. The special interest group, we've had a few meetings now. They've been pretty lively as new members have joined. Got a question there from Inga about the vision for the SIG, which is about preventing the criminalisation and recriminalisation of people with neurodisabilities and disorders. That's the vision, and it's about bringing together a wide community of knowledge and interest in how we actually go about doing that, and seeking to support and publish, etc., to provide the kind of the answers to your question, Inga, in a wider sense. And I think Hugh's got a point to make on that.
Oh yes. Well, once you finish, then that's fine. Nathan drew our attention to the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child Justice section. So when that then became effectively mandated a year or so ago, I think that's really important for people to think about. 187 member states sign up to this, and the key thing being that children with neurodisabilities are overrepresented in criminal justice systems worldwide. And they also made the point of saying that there's a need for societies to react to reduce the chances of kids ending up in criminal justice systems. They're in the wrong place. That's kind of and it's not a good place. It's not going to help their development. It's going to hinder their development. It's going to criminalize them even more down the line. So with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in place, there will be opportunities to review how countries are and state members are interpreting what can be done. And this is an opportunity to share good practice in the area so that we can, with colleagues across law enforcement, public health and social and health services in different ways in different places, can do this and achieve this. It's also linked to initiatives that UNESCO have as well. UNESCO and UNICEF have expressed a strong interest in putting together more awareness for judges, magistrates, policymakers. And so, for example, the next UNESCO meeting on World Congress for Children and Young People and Justice will have a theme around neurodisability, neurodiversity. And importantly, in that context, UNICEF are looking to support work with brain injury organizations such as the Pediatric International Brain Injury Association to look at how we can work across mid and low income contexts and countries where there may be even larger proportions of children and young people affected, in South Africa, for example, or in the Middle East, or in various places where there are children where they're in conflict and environments and so on, where there's even greater likelihood of traumatic stress disorder type disorders in a mix with brain trauma disorders and so on, and fragmented society. So what can be done in different ways in different places, but with the massive gains economically and socially, because it's about trying to put in the kind of systems that would help identify, address issues, and engage put people more readily into more socially healthy lifestyles into the future. So I just wanted to mention those initiatives, and GLEPHA will provide an opportunity for us to share good practice in these areas and research.
Thanks, Hugh. And we've got a couple of questions coming in now, and you mentioned there post-traumatic stress disorder. We've got a question from Jennifer, which is that, do we have the same approach to people with mental health issues that are based in experienced and traumatic experiences that may or may not have affected the brain? So I don't know who'd like to field that one, but how this ties in with ACEs and adverse child experiences.
Sure, shall I? Okay, so so one of the things about mental health problems is that mental health problems are not unique, veridical kind of experiences. Someone is not depressed or anxious for no good reason, and they're but they are descriptors of a general sort of malaise or whatever it might be. And typically in the background of someone with depression and anxiety, PTSD, there's going to be early adversity, developmental issues, and especially in these sort of contexts. And so if you look at the factors that lead to longer range mental health outcome issues, there's often a neurodevelopmental and trauma kind of factor in early childhood that influences things, and support systems or lack of support systems early on in terms of resilience or lack of resilience, and parenting or lack of neglect or lack of neglect, and so on and so forth. So these things actually are fantastically related. And so there's even greater awareness now, thankfully, that brain trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder often co-occur, but that's taken a while for people to understand. And if you look at the long-range consequences of chronic stress disorders in young children exposed to stress early on, you find that their flight or fight systems are affected in a different way. When they hit adolescence, their propensity for acting angrily might be higher. But if you're then having a mix of a brain injury, that reduces your capacity to manage those emotions. So it's about integrating the knowledge so people can understand, oh, this is what we're dealing with in populations who they need help and support. A brain trauma type rehabilitation that we could talk about, and we could certainly in a future one, neurorehabilitation, is about individual goals that can be achieved by stepped programs that can allow people to achieve their optimal kind of outcomes. So that actually means helping to manage one's emotions, being able to manage anger or sadness or whatever it might be in a context. So it's improving those skills. So effectively, approaches that can be brought in are very in line with the kind of mental health approaches that could be incredibly beneficial.
Thank you, Hugh. So we have another question, which is, do we suggest that we should assess all adolescents in the criminal justice system for possible TBI? And how do you think about the ethics of treating these adolescents with TBI differently from other adolescents in the criminal justice system who might have also had their difficulties and trauma growing up? So I don't know if that's one for Stan and Nathan. Or...
I can certainly comment on it. I know we've got another question and time's not on our side, so I'll be brief. So yes, screen everyone for TBI, but also screen them for other neurodevelopmental disorders. We're looking at a range of biopsychosocial issues, and this is about identifying and addressing their kind of vulnerabilities, especially so when it's children, for those kind of reasons that have been mentioned, but for all people, and treat them to their needs. It doesn't have to be treat them differently. It's we'll treat them according to their need, and that would be the approach that I think that we would want to see.
Lovely, that's so concise. Thank you, Stan. And we just have 1 minute just to answer this last question, which is, I wonder if any of the panel have analysed the point at which trajectories change for children. For example, at what point does the focus shift from the need to behaviour, and is the SIG geared towards criminal justice involvement or pre-involvement and missed opportunities to intervene?
you want me to answer that one as well briefly, or Nathan, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, you can do.
Yeah, me. So the point tends to change. It depends on who you're asking, but the point certainly changes when they reach adulthood. As a child, there will be lots of potential care and consideration over their the abuse that they've suffered, etc. But when they start acting out the behaviours associated to that abuse the day after they hit 18, then the compassion tends to move into punishment if it's not been there already. So it needs to be tracked across the system. And then the second part is, yes, we're geared to, and that's the sequential intercept model, really geared to all these areas of pre-involvement, missed opportunities, late intervention and the high cost of late intervention, economically, socially, morally. So it is geared across those kind of areas as well in a broad public health approach to this problem.
Can I just add, just another question there about, is there opportunity for practice-based? Absolutely. The SIG House, we do have in-between kind of meetings, and we can arrange to have a special one-off type meeting if people would like that. And we, for example, have been working with police forces in the UK about identifying, assessing and intervening. And brain injury is a bit like a Trojan horse. You identify that, but other things happen too. So you bring in all the other interventions because it's associated with greater need.
Lovely. Thank you, Hugh. So I think we have to wrap up now, even though there's so many interesting questions to answer. But just a huge thank you to all of our speakers and to everyone who's asked questions and things. And please do get in touch if you'd like to find out a bit more about the group.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Hope. Thank you, Hope, very much. Fantastic sharing. That was brilliant. You have another career ahead of you. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, totally.
No, I'm not saying not until you finish PhD.
Good stuff.
Good.
So